less of a problem for older adults than explicit learning does. Even on some other kinds of memory tasks, older adults will often show less of a deficit relative to younger adults if they're not forewarned about the memory task, or if they're not encouraged in some other way to exert intentional efforts to remember it. And just in general, the harder a task is, the bigger the gap between young and old seems to be. And there's also been a variety of findings. Again, the talk today was here, didn't get a chance to see it at noon. Highlighted like the importance of information to people and how that affects memory and the extent to which older adults can use that kind of information and do better relative to younger adults with highly important information. And in general, across a lot of research on memory, people have found that older adults probably, on average, left to their own devices, use less of their capacity to remember things than young people do. So that cranking up people's motivation or cranking up the importance of the information to be remembered tends to at least narrow the young-old memory differences. So there's this whole kind of stream of literature that suggests that if it's important, older adults will focus on it, but older adults seem to be, both on purpose and maybe not so much on purpose, conserving energy, conserving effort, not putting the same amount of effort into remembering things that younger people do. And of course, as people said more nicely, I think in colloquium today, that younger people, the strongest evidence and the biggest gaps that you see are younger people remembering nonsense information, random word list, list of numbers and so forth, which I think at least up through the undergraduate education level in the U.S., some people would see that as a model for their educational experience. You're constantly learning stuff that you don't really care about, and it seems kind of random.
I felt like in his lecture today he was biased towards the young people. I mean, the way he would compare the groups, and also the way he presented some of the information, and also, well, I mentioned this in the thing, but the younger people are used to doing that on a more regular basis. It's not like a high priority when you're older. You have like a bigger world, and you're not dealing with just memorizing, doing those kind of tasks. It doesn't, but I don't think that means a negative cognitive impact necessarily.
Well, it is, that's a good point. And I think, less cynically, I think education that hopefully pushes you more towards your capacity limits and should give you kind of a workout in your learning and memory abilities. And almost all work environments, I think the more complicated the work is, probably the longer after your formal training for it takes you to get to this point. But at some point, after you've been past your training and education years for a certain amount of time, most of what you do in adult life is on automatic processing. You've done it a lot, you know what to do, you know what you're going to do, you recognize problems at a fairly complicated level, and you're on automatic most of the time. You're doing things habitually. You've got automatic processing. Like, think back, it's not as far back for you guys as it is to me, but you think back when you were learning to drive, when you were first learning to drive, you're getting in, I'm turning it on, I'm putting the gear shift here, okay, see, this is the gas, and this is the brake, and I got to do this and that. And now you just get in the car, you just think about where you're going, and all that level of processing is automatic. It's like, when you're first learning the language, you're having like sound out the letters, and you have to think about what it means. But another lesson in the Stroop task is that word processing is so automatic that it requires energy, effort, inhibition to override it and do something different than what you usually do with it. So, and in different sorts of ways, you are able to, and you can, and most of the time you do throughout much of your adult life, function on automatic. Things can knock you over. Yeah?
I also think it's a little bit difficult. I was agreeing with what you were saying in there, and it's hard because I don't know the longitudinal evidence for this, but even when you're looking at cross-sectional comparisons, it seems to me like there must be somewhat of a cohort effect going on. Because I know that having a small child myself right now, like from birth on, it's like there are like all these different like learning things that they have like in their crib, and it's focused on memory. And then in high school, we have so many standardized tests now that we're kind of told from a very early age now how to remember things and how to rehearse things. Versus when I talked to my parents about their education, that wasn't their experience. Like a lot of that didn't go on, versus I think it's a lot more emphasized now, and that kids are given those tools pretty early on now, that when you're comparing 20-year-olds to 70-year-olds, not only are their daily activities a lot different, but also what they learned from what was emphasized was probably quite a bit different.
People who study intelligence focus on that kind of question quite a bit, and we'll be talking about that in a couple of weeks in detail. People who study this level of cognitive processes want to argue that that's not true. And probably the closest thing that they have to evidence that it's not true is that they would say, well, we've been doing cognitive aging studies for several decades now, and if there were cohort differences, there should be more differences in the cross-sectional evidence than we see there. Now, on the other hand, Liz Zielinski has a study that came out. All I need is for it to reboot. That shows that there are some cohort differences in memory abilities. She's found in the Longreach longitudinal study. They don't eliminate the young-old contrast differences, but they do make them smaller. And we'll talk about probably after break when we start talking about memory kind of interventions. We'll just what that whole kind of process tends to look like. There's also this is a digression from paper, but since we're on this topic, I think it's an interesting issue. There's a couple of things here that say really broad strokes that makes me think of and tell you that's kind of characteristic of the cognitive aging research enterprise. One is that there just do tend to be sort of pessimists and optimists about cognitive aging, and so probably most of the people that do cognitive aging research tend to be on the pessimistic side, and they see age differences everywhere, and they think the age differences are pretty important. And then you get another group of people who really want to say, but the age differences are because the older adults really aren't trying, they're not motivated, kinds of things we've just been talking about, and who generally tend to, and also just will tend to emphasize more in their research and in their summaries of research the areas where you see relatively small age effects. And then there is this kind of